The first sign that something was wrong in my marriage wasn't lipstick on a collar or a strange perfume lingering in the hallway. It was a number, a long one, 14 digits written in dark blue ink on a small, torn square of paper, tucked carefully between the pages of one of my husband's work notebooks. Most people would have ignored it. To most people, it would have looked like nothing more than a random set of numbers someone scribbled down during a phone call. But I had spent nearly a decade working with contracts and payment authorizations in the construction industry in Denver. Numbers like that had a pattern, and that pattern meant one thing: wire transfer authentication. And the moment I saw it, I understood something my husband clearly believed I never would. Someone in this house was moving money, and they were trying very hard not to be noticed. It was a quiet Tuesday evening in early October, the kind of cool Denver night when the air smells faintly like dry leaves and chimney smoke. Ethan had just stepped out to pick up takeout from a place he liked downtown, leaving me alone in the house for about 20 minutes. I hadn't gone into his office looking for secrets. I was looking for our homeowner's insurance paperwork. Our filing cabinet in the hallway had become a disaster over the years, so Ethan had started keeping work and financial documents in his home office instead. His desk sat by the window, overlooking our backyard, papers stacked in neat piles that looked organized only to him. I found the insurance folder in the second drawer almost immediately. The little scrap of paper fell out when I pulled the folder free. At first, I didn't think anything of it, but when I picked it up, the number caught my attention instantly. Not just the length, the format, 4 groups, specific spacing, the exact structure used for certain bank confirmation codes. I sat down slowly in Ethan's desk chair. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. 14 digits. My first instinct was simple curiosity. Maybe it was a client transaction. Ethan worked in finance for a logistics company. Large transfers were part of his job. But then another thought crept in. If it was normal work information, why hide it inside a notebook instead of entering it into a system? Why write it down at all? And why tuck it into the middle of a notebook instead of leaving it on the desk? The answers didn't make sense. And suddenly, neither did the last 6 months of our marriage. The late nights, the sudden work trips, the quiet way Ethan had started guarding his phone like it contained classified government secrets. I looked down at the number again. A strange chill moved through me. Not panic, not anger, just the quiet feeling that something important had just shifted. I pulled my own phone out and opened the Notes app. Then I carefully typed in the entire number exactly as it appeared. 14 digits. No mistakes, no guesses. When I finished, I looked around the office once more. Everything exactly as Ethan had left it. I folded the scrap of paper and slipped it back between the notebook pages, pressing it gently so it sat in the same place it had before. By the time Ethan's truck pulled into the driveway, a few minutes later, I was already back in the kitchen. The insurance folder sat on the counter beside me. Dinner smelled like orange chicken and fried rice. To Ethan, it probably looked like a completely ordinary Tuesday night. But as I stirred the rice with a wooden spoon, one quiet realization settled into my mind. If my husband was secretly moving money, he clearly believed I would never notice. And for the first time in our 7-year marriage, I decided not to ask a single question. Not yet, because sometimes the most powerful move you can make is pretending you don't see the game at all. The number stayed in my phone. I didn't delete it. I didn't search it either. Instead, over the next few days, I found myself opening the note again and again, staring at those 14 digits like they might suddenly explain themselves. They never did, but something else did. Patterns. The following Friday morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, a mug of coffee cooling beside me. Ethan had already left for work. He usually left around 7:15 a.m., earlier than I did, because the logistics firm he worked for was on the other side of Denver. The house felt unusually quiet after he drove away. For the first time since I had copied that number, I logged into our household banking account. Normally, I only checked it once or twice a month, just enough to pay bills and keep track of our savings. Ethan handled most of the investment stuff. It had always seemed easier that way. That morning, though, I started scrolling. At first, everything looked normal. Mortgage payment, utilities, groceries, gas, the usual rhythm of everyday life. Then I noticed something small. A transfer. It wasn't large enough to stand out, just under $2,000. The description didn't include much detail, only a routing code and a confirmation number. I might have ignored it, but the confirmation number caught my eye. The structure looked familiar. 4 segments, similar spacing. Not identical to the one I had copied from Ethan's notebook, but close enough to make me pause. I scrolled back further. Another transfer appeared 3 weeks earlier, then another, and another, each one between $1,500 and $2,000. Individually, they didn't look alarming, but together they formed something unmistakable. A pattern. The transfers appeared roughly every 3 weeks, always late at night, always followed by one of Ethan's sudden work trips. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. 6 months. That's how far the pattern went. 6 months of small, careful movements. If I hadn't been looking for something, I probably never would have noticed. Which I realized slowly was probably the point. Later that evening, Ethan came home around 8. He walked into the kitchen with the same tired expression he'd been wearing a lot lately, loosening his tie as he set his keys on the counter. "Long day," he said. I nodded and slid a plate toward him. Chickens, still warm. He thanked me and started eating. From the outside, nothing about the evening looked unusual. But now that I had seen the pattern, other things began to stand out. The way Ethan kept his phone face down on the table. How he picked it up almost immediately when it buzzed. How he angled the screen slightly away when he checked messages. 6 months ago, he had never done that. Halfway through dinner, his phone lit up again. Just for a second. A preview notification. I didn't mean to look, but I did. The name that appeared wasn't one I recognized. Lily. The message itself was short, just a few words. But there was something about the tone, casual, familiar, that made my chest tighten. Ethan reached for the phone, quickly, clearing the notification before I could read the rest. He didn't look up, didn't say anything, and I didn't ask. After dinner, he went into the living room to watch television while I cleaned the kitchen. The house felt different now. Not broken, not yet, but quieter, like something invisible had settled between us. Before going to bed that night, I opened my phone again and added a new note beneath the 14-digit number. Transfer pattern every 3 weeks. Late night. Trips follow. Possible connection. I stared at the words for a moment. Then I added one more line. Estimated total, so far, about $60,000. When I set my phone down on the nightstand, Ethan was already asleep beside me. His breathing slow and steady, peaceful. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. 6 months of hidden transfers. And a name I had never heard before, Lily. I didn't know who she was yet, but somehow I had the feeling that before long, I would. The following Monday morning arrived colder than usual. Denver in October had a way of doing that. One week, you could still drink coffee outside, and the next, you woke up to frost along the edges of the grass. Ethan had already left for work by the time I came downstairs. His travel mug was gone from the counter, and the garage door had finished closing only minutes earlier. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, staring out the window at the quiet backyard. Then I picked up my phone. The note was still there, 14 digits. Below it, my growing list of observations, the 3-week transfer pattern, the estimated $60,000, and the name Lily. For the past few days, I had told myself I was probably reading too much into things. But something about the situation refused to settle. That morning, instead of opening my work email, I opened my laptop and typed 2 words into the search bar. Lily Turner. It was a common enough name that dozens of results appeared instantly. LinkedIn profiles, Facebook pages, a few real estate listings with the same name. For a moment, I almost closed the browser. Then I remembered something from the message notification I had seen. A small detail that had seemed unimportant at the time. The company logo next to Ethan's contact list. If Lily worked with him, that narrowed things down. I added the company name to the search. The results changed immediately. There she was, Lily Turner, Operations Coordinator at Summit Bridge Logistics, the same company Ethan had been working for the last 4 years. Her LinkedIn photo showed a woman in her late 20s with straight, dark hair and a confident smile, standing in front of a glass office building somewhere downtown. I felt something tighten in my chest. Maybe it was nothing. People worked together. They texted about projects. Late-night messages didn't automatically mean anything. Still, I clicked on her profile. Her employment history was short. She had joined Summit Bridge about 8 months ago. 8 months. I leaned back slightly in my chair. 6 months of secret transfers. 8 months since Lily joined Ethan's company. The timeline wasn't proof of anything, but it was close enough to make me uncomfortable. I closed the page and rubbed my hands together, trying to shake the feeling away. It could still be coincidence. Work trips happened all the time in logistics. But later that afternoon, another detail appeared that made the coincidence harder to ignore. Ethan's credit card notification popped up on the shared budgeting app we used. Most couples our age probably wouldn't bother sharing financial alerts, but we had set it up years earlier when we bought the house. The purchase wasn't large, just a reservation charge. But the location caught my eye immediately. Austin, Texas. I frowned slightly. Ethan had mentioned a possible trip there once or twice over the summer, something about a new regional contract. Still seeing the charge appear in real time felt different. I tapped the transaction to open the details. Hotel reservation, 3 nights. The confirmation date was set for the following week. I stared at the screen for a moment, then opened another browser tab. Austin apartment listings appeared quickly. I wasn't even sure why I searched. Maybe it was just curiosity. Maybe it was instinct. Scrolling through the listings, one of them made me stop. A modern high-rise downtown, floor-to-ceiling windows. Monthly rent that was far higher than anything a short business trip would require. I clicked the listing. The page showed the leasing company, along with a contact name, attached to a recently created corporate inquiry. The company name didn't mean anything to me, but one small line underneath it did. Registered agent Ethan Donovan. My stomach dropped slightly. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. A new company. a luxury apartment inquiry, and a hotel reservation in the same city. None of it proved anything yet, not directly. But the pieces were starting to look less like coincidences and more like preparation. That evening, when Ethan came home, he acted exactly the same as always. He asked about my day, he talked about work, he laughed at something on television. But now every word felt slightly different, like listening to someone rehearse a script you hadn't been given. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, I opened my phone again. Beneath the bank code and the transfer pattern, I added 3 more notes. Lily Turner Summit, Bridge Logistics, Austin Hotel Reservation, new company registration connected to Ethan. I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone down. I still didn't know exactly what Ethan was planning, but one quiet realization had started to take shape. My husband might not just be hiding money. He might be building an entirely new life. And somehow, I wasn't part of it. By the middle of the following week, the quiet tension in the house had begun to feel heavier. Not dramatic, not explosive, just heavier. On Wednesday evening, Ethan packed his suitcase for the Austin trip. He did it casually, like he had packed for dozens of business trips before. A button-down shirt folded over the edge of the bed, his laptop charger wrapped neatly around his hand. The same navy carry-on he always used leaning against the dresser. From the outside, nothing about it looked unusual. But now that I had seen the apartment, listing the hotel reservation, and the company registration connected to his name, every small movement felt different, calculated. I sat at the edge of the bed, pretending to scroll through my phone, while Ethan zipped the suitcase closed. "How long is the trip again?" I asked lightly. "Just a few days," he said. "Austin office needs some help with the logistics rollout." His answer came quickly, too quickly. I nodded as if the explanation made perfect sense. Maybe 6 months ago it would have. But the moment he stepped out of the bedroom to take a phone call, I opened the note on my phone again. The list had grown longer. The bank code, the transfer pattern, Lily Turner, Austin Hotel Reservation, new company registration. The pieces still didn't form a complete picture, but they were beginning to point in the same direction. Preparation, not for a business trip, for something permanent. Ethan left early the next morning. Thursday morning traffic in Denver was already thick when he pulled his suitcase through the garage and loaded it into the truck. I stood by the front window and watched him drive away. For several minutes after the truck disappeared around the corner, I didn't move. My first instinct was still the same one I'd had all week. Wait. Observe. Don't make assumptions. But another thought had started pushing its way into the front of my mind. If Ethan really was planning to start a new life somewhere else, what happened to everything we had built together? The house, the savings, the investments. 7 years of shared finances. I went back into the kitchen and opened my laptop. The banking account appeared again on the screen. The numbers hadn't changed much since the last time I looked, but now they felt fragile, like something that could disappear if I stopped paying attention. I spent nearly an hour reviewing our accounts. Mortgage balance, joint savings, retirement contributions. Nothing looked wrong yet, at least not on the surface. But the pattern from the last 6 months was impossible to ignore now. Small transfers, consistent timing, and that hidden bank code sitting in Ethan's notebook. Eventually, I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. For the first time since this whole thing had started, a practical fear settled into my chest. Not fear of betrayal, something quieter. Financial vulnerability. If Ethan had already been moving money without telling me, there was no guarantee he would stop. And if his plan involved leaving, he might already be preparing to take more. The thought sat there for a long moment. Then another realization followed it. I didn't actually know what my legal position would be if that happened. We had always handled money together. I had trusted him with most of the investment decisions, but trust didn't mean protection. That afternoon, while driving home from work, I passed a small brick office building near downtown Denver that I had driven by hundreds of times before. A brass sign by the entrance caught my eye: Family Law and Asset Protection. I slowed at the light long enough to read the name below it: Michael Reeves. The light turned green, and the cars behind me began to move. I kept driving, but the name stayed in my mind the entire way home. That evening, the house felt even quieter than usual. Ethan's suitcase was gone. His side of the closet looked strangely empty. I reheated leftovers for dinner and sat at the kitchen table alone. For a long time, I stared at the same note on my phone. Then slowly, I opened a new contact entry. Name: Michael Reeves. I didn't call, not yet. But before going to bed that night, I saved the number anyway, just in case, because something in my gut was beginning to whisper a truth I wasn't ready to say out loud. If Ethan was quietly planning his escape, I might need to start planning mine. On Friday, the house felt too big for one person. Ethan was still in Austin. His side of the bed stayed smooth. His coffee mug stayed in the cabinet. Every little sign of his absence should have been ordinary. He traveled for work, but nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. That afternoon, I left work a few minutes early and drove back toward the small brick building I'd noticed the day before. Family Law and Asset Protection. The words had sounded dramatic when I first read them, like something you only needed if your life was already on fire. But as I sat at a red light and watched pedestrians cross in the crisp Denver air, it hit me with a calm, unwelcome clarity. My life didn't have to be on fire for me to smell smoke. I parked, sat in the car for a full minute, and stared at my hands on the steering wheel. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I was doing math in my head. Mortgage, savings, retirement, the equity we'd built, the transfers I'd already counted. If Ethan had been moving money quietly for 6 months, he wasn't doing it for fun. And if he was building something in Austin, I couldn't afford to be the only person in this marriage who still believed in fairness. Inside the office smelled faintly like paper and black coffee. A receptionist asked my name, and when I said it, she offered a polite smile that didn't feel like pity, more like she'd seen plenty of people walk in with tight shoulders and careful voices. A few minutes later, Michael Reeves stepped into the lobby. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with the steady expression of someone who didn't get startled easily. His suit wasn't flashy. His tie was simple, the kind of man who looked like he kept his promises because he chose his words carefully. "Claire Donovan," he asked. I nodded. "Come on back." His office was neat and quiet. No dramatic decor, just files, framed diplomas, and a small photo of a golden retriever on his desk. I didn't tell him everything. Not at first. I started with the safe facts: married 7 years, joint accounts, recent, unexplained transfers, a spouse who handled most investments, and a growing concern about what would happen if the marriage ended suddenly. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finally mentioned the handwritten bank code without showing it to him yet, his eyes narrowed slightly, not with shock, but with recognition. "That's not unusual in certain situations," he said carefully. "But it's also not something you ignore." He asked me a series of questions that felt less like gossip and more like inventory. Did I have separate property? Anything inherited? Anything owned before marriage, any accounts in my name only. I told him about my grandmother's inheritance, a modest but meaningful amount that had been sitting quietly in an account I rarely touched. Ethan knew it existed, but he'd never been interested in it. He'd called it old family money, like it wasn't worth the effort. Michael nodded. That matters. He explained in plain language that silence in a marriage didn't protect you in a divorce. Documentation did, timing did, clarity did. He didn't tell me to file. He didn't tell me to confront Ethan. He told me something simpler and somehow harder. Start separating what is clearly yours, he said. Do it cleanly, do it legally, and do it without giving anyone a reason to rush. On the drive home, the sun was already low behind the Rockies, turning the sky the soft orange color that usually made me feel grateful. That evening, it didn't. At home, I opened my laptop and logged into the account tied to my inheritance. The balance stared back at me like a quiet promise I hadn't wanted to rely on. I didn't drain it. I didn't do anything reckless. I opened a new savings account in my name, only the way Michael had described, and set it up slowly, step by step, like tightening a seatbelt before a crash you hope never comes. Then I pulled out a plain notebook from the kitchen drawer and wrote one line across the first page. Keep a record. Keep it calm. Keep it mine. I closed the notebook and set it beside my phone, right next to the 14-digit code I still hadn't erased. For the first time in days, I understood the choice in front of me. I could keep waiting for Ethan to decide what my future would look like, or I could start protecting it myself. And once that thought settled in, I knew there was no going back to the old kind of silence. Ethan came home the following Sunday evening. Denver was already dark by the time his truck pulled into the driveway. I heard the garage door open while I was rinsing dishes in the kitchen sink, the familiar rumble of the engine echoing briefly before shutting off. For a moment, I simply stood there, hands in warm water, staring out the window. 3 days earlier, I had opened a new savings account in my name. 2 days earlier, I had quietly moved the first portion of my grandmother's inheritance into it. Nothing dramatic, just a careful transfer that Michael Reeves had assured me was completely legal. I had written every step down in the notebook. Keep a record, keep it calm, keep it mine. By the time Ethan walked through the kitchen door, I had already dried my hands and placed the notebook back inside the drawer. "Hey," he said, dropping his keys on the counter. "Hey." He looked relaxed, maybe even pleased with himself. Austin had apparently been a good trip. "How was it?" I asked. "Busy," he said, "but productive." He opened the refrigerator and grabbed a bottle of water, taking a long drink before leaning against the counter. There was something new in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there a few weeks ago, like a man who believed things were finally lining up the way he wanted. We talked about ordinary things for a while: traffic work, a new restaurant someone had recommended downtown. But while Ethan spoke, my attention kept drifting to his phone, lying on the counter, face down, always face down. Eventually, it buzzed. The vibration rattled softly against the granite surface. Ethan picked it up almost instantly, glancing at the screen before slipping it back into his pocket. "Work?" he said casually. I nodded, but something inside me had shifted over the weekend. For days, I had been observing quietly, piecing things together, protecting what I could. Now, for the first time, I decided to test the surface. Did the Austin office end up needing that new apartment space? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Ethan's reaction was small. So small, most people might have missed it. A half-second pause, His shoulders tightened just slightly before he turned back toward the sink. "What apartment?" he asked. "The one downtown," I said, wiping the counter with a dish towel. "I saw some listings when I was looking at hotels in Austin the other day." "That city's getting expensive." He laughed softly. "Yeah, it is." But he didn't answer the question. Instead, he walked past me into the living room. "Mostly meetings," he said over his shoulder. "Hotels are easier for short trips." The conversation ended there, but the pause stayed with me. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open again. The joint account transactions hadn't changed much since Friday. But a new transfer appeared around midnight during Ethan's trip. Another $1,850. Same pattern, same routing format. 6 months of these small movements had already added up to a quiet disappearance. And now, the pace seemed to be increasing. I opened my notebook and wrote down the date beside the new transaction. Then I added another line underneath it. Ethan denied knowledge of Austin apartment inquiry. The words looked calm on paper, but the implication behind them was louder. For the first time since this started, Ethan had lied to my face. Not angrily, not defensively, just easily, like someone who had already rehearsed the answer. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. Across the house, Ethan slept peacefully, completely unaware that the quiet version of me, the one who trusted everything he said, was slowly disappearing. In its place, something else was beginning to take shape, something more careful, more patient, more deliberate. Because if Ethan believed he was the only one quietly preparing for the future, he had just made the first mistake in a much bigger game. The conversation happened on a Tuesday night. It was late October, the kind of Denver evening where the temperature dropped fast after sunset, and the windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside the house. I had just finished loading the dishwasher when Ethan walked into the kitchen with a seriousness I hadn't seen before. "Claire," he said, clearing his throat. "Can we talk for a minute?" I dried my hands on a towel and nodded. "Sure." We moved into the living room. Ethan sat in the armchair across from the couch instead of next to me like he usually did. The distance between us felt deliberate. For a moment, he just stared at his hands. Then he spoke. "I've been thinking about things for a while," he began. "About us." The words were calm, rehearsed. "I don't think this marriage is working anymore." The sentence landed quietly in the room. No yelling, no accusations, just a carefully measured conclusion. "I think we should separate," he continued, "and move forward with a divorce." For a second, I studied his face. He didn't look guilty. If anything, he looked relieved, like someone who had finally said something he'd been practicing in his head for weeks. "I see," I said. My calm reaction seemed to surprise him. Ethan shifted slightly in his chair. "I want to do this the right way," he said quickly. "Keep things simple. No drawn-out fights. Just divide everything fairly and move on, fairly." The word hung in the air between us. Images flashed through my mind. The hidden transfers, the Austin apartment inquiry, Lily's name lighting up his phone. "Fair." I folded my hands in my lap. "What does simple look like to you?" I asked. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Well, the house can go on the market. We split the equity. Savings, too. Retirement accounts get divided the usual way." His voice stayed steady, almost businesslike. But there was something underneath it. Expectation. Like he believed I would accept the proposal, without much resistance. "What about the other accounts?" I asked quietly. Ethan frowned. "What other accounts?" "The ones you've been transferring money into for the last 6 months." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. For the first time that night, Ethan's confidence cracked. It wasn't dramatic, just a tightening around his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. The denial came fast, almost automatic. I watched him carefully. "You're sure I asked?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Absolutely." The lie sat between us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair. "Look," he said, his tone sharpening slightly. "I'm not trying to fight here. I just think it's better if we handle this like adults. Handle this like adults." The phrase felt oddly ironic. "Okay," I said. That seemed to ease his tension a little. "Good," he replied. "Then we can probably get the paperwork started soon." Paperwork. Another word that sounded strangely tidy for something that had been quietly unraveling for months. Later that night, after Ethan went upstairs, I stayed in the living room, staring at the dark television screen. The conversation had confirmed something important. Ethan believed he was still ahead. He believed the hidden transfers were invisible. He believed I would walk into the divorce negotiation without understanding the full picture. But something else had become clear too. The timeline had just accelerated. Divorce meant financial disclosure, documents, account records. Every hidden movement eventually had to be explained, which meant the quiet strategy I had started weeks earlier was no longer just precaution. It was protection. I stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen. The notebook was still inside the drawer. I opened it and wrote a new line under the latest transaction. Tuesday night, Ethan asked for divorce. Denies transfers. As I closed the notebook, a strange calm settled over me. For months, Ethan had been quietly preparing his exit. Now, he believed the moment had finally arrived. But the truth was something he still didn't understand. The game hadn't ended tonight. It had just entered a new phase. And for the first time since this started, both of us were finally playing. The next morning was Wednesday. Denver looked washed out under a low gray sky, and the first real cold snap of the season had turned the sidewalks slick with a thin crust of ice near the gutters. Ethan had already left for work, as if nothing had happened the night before, as if telling your wife you wanted a divorce was just another item on a Tuesday checklist. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from the mug. For a few minutes, the only thing I could hear was the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then I opened my notebook. Tuesday night. Ethan asked for divorce. Denies transfers. Seeing it written down changed something in me. It took the emotion out of it. It made it concrete. A fact. A marker. And it also made one mistake painfully obvious. I had shown my hand. Not fully, but enough. The second I mentioned the transfers, I had warned him that I was looking. If Ethan had been quietly moving money for 6 months, he wasn't going to stop now. He was going to speed up. I didn't have time for vague suspicion anymore. I needed structure, documentation, a clean way to force the truth into daylight without turning my home into a battlefield. At 9:05 a.m., I called Michael Reeves. His assistant put me through within a few minutes. "I need to move faster," I said, the moment Michael picked up. He didn't ask for drama. He didn't ask why. He simply said, "Tell me what changed." "He asked for a divorce last night," I said, "and he denied the transfers." There was a pause. Then calmly, "Okay, next step is making sure you can prove what you've seen." Michael told me to gather 3 things: printed bank statements, showing the transfer pattern, any evidence tying Ethan to the destination accounts or entities, and a timeline dates, amounts, and any corresponding travel. Your memory won't hold up under pressure, he said. Paper will. After I hung up, I worked like someone preparing for an audit. I logged into every account I had access to and downloaded statements month by month. I highlighted transfers that matched the pattern, late night, 3-week rhythm, similar routing format. I printed them and laid them on the table in neat stacks. Then I opened another browser tab and searched public records the way I had done before, except this time I wasn't scrolling out of instinct. I was looking for proof that could stand up in a legal room. That's when I found it. Not on social media, not in a text message, in a filing database. A newly formed LLC registered in Texas, created just over a month earlier. The name was bland, the kind designed to disappear into a sea of similar companies. Donovan Ridge Holdings, LLC. My throat tightened as I read the details. Registered agent Ethan Donovan. Mailing address a suite number in downtown Austin, one that matched the hotel reservation neighborhood. And there, under the company's banking contact line, was something that made my skin go cold. A partial account identifier. The last 4 digits matched the destination on 2 of the recent transfers from our joint savings. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt focused. Because for the first time, I had something solid, something Ethan couldn't laugh off or deny without consequences. I took screenshots, downloaded the filing as a PDF, and printed it. Then I placed it on top of the bank statements like a cover page. That afternoon, Ethan texted me. We should keep this respectful. I'll send you a name for a mediator. Respectful. As if he hadn't been quietly siphoning money away while planning a new life. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back only one word. Okay, no emotion, no questions, just enough calm to keep him comfortable. Because now I understood the real advantage I had. Ethan thought this was a conversation, a negotiation, a soft landing. But with a paper trail in my hands, I wasn't walking into a conversation anymore. I was building a case. And the system, slow as it could be, was finally something I could set in motion. By Friday, the air in Denver had turned sharp and dry, the kind that made your skin feel tight the moment you stepped outside. Ethan called it moving efficiently. He sent me a mediator's name, a downtown office address, and a time slot for late afternoon, like we were scheduling a dentist appointment, not dismantling a life. I agreed without hesitation, not because I was cooperative, because I was prepared. Before I left the house, I packed a slim folder into my tote bag. Inside were printed bank statements, the highlighted transfer pattern, the Texas LLC filing for Donovan Ridge Holdings, and a simple timeline written in my notebook, dates, amounts, and the matching travel windows. No speeches, no threats, just paper. The mediation office sat on the 12th floor of a clean glass building with a view of the mountains. The waiting room smelled like lemon cleaner and stale coffee. A gray-haired woman behind the desk asked us to sign in. Ethan arrived 5 minutes after me, wearing his professional face, calm, pleasant, almost warm. The kind of expression that made strangers assume he was reasonable. He didn't sit beside me. He sat across the room and scrolled on his phone, face down, whenever I looked up. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 60s stepped into the doorway and introduced herself as Janice Howell, the mediator. Her tone was gentle but firm, practiced in the way people become when they've watched thousands of couples try to stay polite while falling apart. She led us into a small conference room with a round table, a box of tissues, and a pitcher of water no one looked like they would touch. Janice started with basics, assets, debts, proposed timelines. Ethan spoke first, as if he'd been waiting for the spotlight. "We want this amicable," he said. "We can sell the house, split equity, divide, retirement. Claire and I both work. No reason to make this ugly." I watched him deliver the lines smoothly, like he'd rehearsed them in his truck mirror. Janice nodded, taking notes. Then she turned to me. "Claire." I placed my folder on the table and slid one document out, just one. "I also want this handled cleanly," I said. "But I need full financial transparency before we talk about fair." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Janice's pen paused. "What kind of transparency?" she asked. I kept my voice even. "Transfers from our joint savings account. Repeated. Over the last 6 months." Ethan leaned back and let out a small laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "That's not accurate," he said quickly. "There haven't been any unusual transfers." Janice looked between us. "Claire, do you have documentation?" "Yes," I said, and slid the highlighted bank statements forward. The room went quiet, except for the paper moving across the table. Janice adjusted her glasses and scanned the pages. Ethan's gaze stayed fixed on the tabletop, like he could will the ink to disappear. Janice didn't accuse him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "Mr. Donovan, can you explain these transfers?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "They're investments," he said. "Temporary allocations." Janice's eyes remained calm. "Investments," where Ethan hesitated. "Just long enough." Then he said, "A business account." Janice nodded once, as if noting something obvious, in whose name Ethan's fingers tapped the edge of the table. "That's not relevant," he said, tone tightening. "It's separate." Janice's voice stayed level. "If marital funds moved into an entity or account, it is relevant to division." That was the moment Ethan stopped pretending. His shoulders stiffened and his expression hardened into something colder. "This is exactly what I didn't want," he said, looking at me. "Claire, you're turning this into a fight." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I pulled out the Texas filing and placed it on the table. "Donovan Ridge Holdings, LLC," I said quietly. "Registered agent, Ethan Donovan. Formed last month. Linked to the same last 4 digits as these transfers." Ethan's face went pale in a way that was almost subtle, but not enough. Janice read the filing slowly. When she looked up, her tone didn't change, but the air in the room did. "Mr. Donovan," she said, "I'm going to recommend that this mediation pause until both parties provide complete financial disclosures. If funds were moved in anticipation of divorce, that can become a serious legal issue." Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since he'd asked for a divorce, he looked uncertain. Not angry, not triumphant, uncertain. Like a man realizing the floor might not be as solid as he assumed. As we stood to leave, his phone buzzed on the table. He snatched it up too fast. A name flashed on the screen before he could hide it. Lily. He turned away immediately, but the damage was done. Janice had seen it. I had seen it. And more importantly, Ethan knew we'd seen it. In the elevator ride down, he didn't speak. Neither did I. I just held my folder against my chest and stared at the numbers on the floor display as they ticked down. Because the stakes weren't theoretical anymore. Ethan's secret wasn't just a suspicion. It was documented. And now the system had its first clear reason to dig. The following Monday, Denver felt brighter, not warmer, just clearer. At 8:17 a.m., my phone lit up with a call from Michael Reeves. His voice was calm, but there was a difference in it now. Less caution, more certainty. "Claire," he said, the disclosure request worked. Ethan's attorney had responded over the weekend after Janice Howell formally paused mediation. The message was polite, almost overly so, but the attachments told the real story. There were accounts Ethan hadn't mentioned. A business account tied to Donovan Ridge Holdings, a second account connected to a payment platform I'd never used, and a ledger of transfers that matched every highlighted line in my folder, only now the totals were impossible to minimize. Michael didn't sound impressed. He sounded practical. "This is the point where people stop negotiating with confidence," he said, "and start negotiating with reality." By noon, the court filed an emergency motion for temporary financial orders, nothing theatrical, just the legal equivalent of putting a lid on a boiling pot. The judge ordered both parties to maintain the status quo, prohibited further transfers without mutual consent, and required full documentation of all accounts and entities created during the marriage. And then the part Ethan had been counting on never happened. He couldn't keep it quiet, because once lawyers started pulling records, names and patterns surfaced fast. The Austin Suite address wasn't just a mailing address. It was tied to a lease application. And Lily Turner's name, kept carefully off paper for months, appeared exactly where it shouldn't have. An internal email chain, a payment authorization, a signature line on a vendor form linked to Ethan's Texas entity. By Wednesday, Ethan's professional face cracked in a way I didn't have to witness up close. He showed up at the house to pick up a few things, moving quickly, avoiding my eyes. His voice was tight when he spoke. "We'll handle this through attorneys," he said. I didn't argue. I just watched him carry out a box of files he'd once guarded, like secrets, his hands gripping the cardboard too hard. 2 days later, Michael called again. His counsel agreed to reverse the transfers, he said. Full accounting, restitution to the marital estate. Your inheritance funds are documented as separate and protected. It wasn't revenge in the cinematic sense. No grand speech, no public humiliation, just a quiet return of what had been quietly taken. Ethan didn't win, not because I outshouted him, because I outdocumented him. By the time the final settlement was drafted, the house stayed mine, not as a trophy, but as stability, because the down payment trail, the inheritance records, and the timing of his transfers made it undeniable. Ethan walked away with his personal belongings, a reduced share, and a reality he couldn't rewrite. Lily disappeared from his life just as neatly as she had entered it when there was no money to orbit anymore. On the first Saturday, after everything was signed, I sat at the kitchen table with my plain notebook open. The last page held months of dates, amounts, and careful notes, evidence of a marriage that ended on paper before it ended out loud. I tore that final page out, folded it once, and placed it in a file folder labeled Closed. Then I wrote one new line on a clean page. Start again, slowly, honestly. That afternoon, I took a long walk through my neighborhood and noticed something I hadn't noticed in weeks. My shoulders weren't tight. My jaw wasn't clenched. I wasn't waiting for a phone to buzz face down on a counter. I was just walking alone, intact, and finally back inside my own life. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite the truth while you stood quietly holding the records, I'd love to hear how you handled it. Share what justice and healing have looked like in your world. And if you want another story where calm wins over cruelty, tap like, subscribe, and join me for the next one.